January 1st, 1863. A single piece of paper lands on the desk of a Confederate general in Virginia. He reads it once, then again. His hands begin to tremble. The document isn't a battle plan. It's not a surrender demand. It's something far more dangerous to everything the Confederacy stands for. It's the Emancipation Proclamation, and buried in the legal language is one sentence that will haunt the South's nightmares for the next 3 years. And I further declare that such persons of suitable condition will be received into the armed service of the United States. Translation: the President of the United States just authorized the enlistment of black soldiers. Not as laborers, not as servants, as armed combatants with rifles, uniforms, and the full authority of the Union Army behind them. Within 48 hours, Confederate newspapers are screaming that Lincoln has declared race war. Southern senators are calling it the most dangerous act in American history. Slave owners are fleeing plantations in terror. But here's what they don't teach you in school, and what's been carefully edited out of most history books for over 150 years. Those black soldiers didn't just fight. They didn't just contribute. They won the war. And in the process, they did something that would be systematically erased from American memory. Because if people knew the truth, it would shatter everything we've been told about race, power, and who really controls the narrative of American history. What you're about to hear isn't speculation. It's not revised history or activist storytelling. Every fact, every name, every battle I'm about to share is documented in military records, pension files, and the letters of the soldiers themselves. The only reason you don't know this story is because it was deliberately hidden. Before we dive into one of the most suppressed chapters of American history, if you value the truth, the real stories they don't want taught in classrooms, hit that like button right now, subscribe to the Forbidden Archive, and click the bell icon so you never miss a video. Because what we uncover here doesn't just rewrite history. It reveals why certain stories are buried in the first place. Now, let's go back to 1863. Imagine you're a 19-year-old man named William Carney. You were born enslaved in Norfolk, Virginia. You've spent your entire life watching white men treat you as property, watching them buy and sell your family members like livestock, watching them beat men for learning to read. And now, for the first time in your life, you're holding a rifle. Not stolen, not hidden, issued to you by the United States Army. You're wearing a Union blue uniform with brass buttons. Your regiment has a flag. You have a rank. You answer to black sergeants who answer to black officers. And in a few months, you're going to charge a Confederate fort under a hail of bullets and become the first black soldier to earn the Medal of Honor. But the question nobody asks in the history books is this: why were black soldiers so terrifying to the Confederacy that their mere existence almost caused the South to collapse before a single shot was fired? The answer to that question changes everything. To understand why black soldiers terrified the Confederacy, you have to understand what the South's entire war effort was built on. The Confederacy wasn't just fighting for independence. They were fighting to preserve a very specific idea: that black people were naturally inferior, incapable of courage, discipline, or intelligence. That they needed white masters to survive. That they were, in the words of Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens, a subordinate race whose enslavement was the natural order of things. This wasn't just propaganda. This was the cornerstone of their entire society. Everything, their economy, their laws, their religion, their sense of identity rested on this belief. And then Lincoln did something that struck at the very heart of that belief. He armed them. Think about what that meant. If black men could stand in formation, follow orders, load rifles under fire, charge enemy positions, and fight with the same discipline as white soldiers, then everything the Confederacy claimed was a lie. Their entire worldview would collapse. Confederate President Jefferson Davis understood this immediately. In December 1862, before the Emancipation Proclamation was even officially issued, he released a statement that revealed just how deep the panic went. He declared that any black soldiers captured in battle would not be treated as prisoners of war. Instead, they would be returned to slavery or executed, and their white officers, they would be tried for inciting slave insurrection and hanged. This wasn't a military policy. This was psychological warfare born from absolute terror. Because Davis knew something that most people today don't realize. The Confederacy's greatest weapon wasn't their generals or their fighting spirit. It was the 4 million enslaved people working their plantations while white men went off to war. Those enslaved people were growing the food that fed Confederate armies. They were building the fortifications. They were working in factories producing ammunition and supplies. The Confederate war machine literally ran on slave labor. Now imagine what happens when those same people suddenly have an option, an escape route, a chance to fight back. By the spring of 1863, the word had spread through the plantation grapevine, that invisible network of communication that enslaved people had perfected over generations. Union armies are recruiting black soldiers. They're paying wages. They're giving out uniforms and weapons. And families can follow the regiments to freedom. Plantations across the South began hemorrhaging workers. First, it was a trickle. A few men disappearing in the night. Then dozens. Then hundreds. Entire communities picking up and walking toward Union lines, leaving their former masters standing in empty fields, screaming threats that no longer carried any weight. One Confederate officer wrote in his diary that he woke up one morning to find 60 of his workers gone, just vanished. His cotton rotting in the fields because there was nobody left to pick it. He wrote, "The Negroes are leaving in droves. We cannot stop them. The institution is dying before our eyes." And here's where it gets even more devastating for the Confederacy. These men weren't just running away. They were running toward something. They were enlisting, training, learning to read, learning military tactics, and then they were coming back as soldiers. Imagine being a Confederate soldier, fighting to preserve slavery, and suddenly you're facing men you used to own. Men who know the terrain better than you do. Men who have personal scores to settle. Men who are fighting not just for military victory, but for the liberation of their families. The psychological impact was crushing. Confederate soldiers started deserting in massive numbers, especially poor whites who'd never owned slaves in the first place. They'd been told they were fighting for Southern honor and independence. But when they saw black men in Union uniforms fighting with discipline and courage, the lie became impossible to maintain. Why should they die to protect rich men's plantations when those same rich men were hiding at home? But here's the part that really breaks the historical narrative wide open, the part that explains why this story had to be erased. Black soldiers didn't just perform well. They exceeded every expectation. And the Union military leadership knew it. By 1864, Ulysses S. Grant, the commanding general of all Union armies, was specifically requesting black regiments for the most dangerous assignments. Not because he was sacrificing them, though they did face higher casualty rates, but because they fought with a ferocity and determination that white units couldn't match. They had everything to lose. Every battle was personal. Surrender meant execution or re-enslavement. So they didn't surrender. What would you do if you knew that retreating meant your family would remain in chains forever? If you knew that losing this war meant your children would be born into slavery? You'd fight like your life depended on it. Because it did. July 18, 1863. Fort Wagner, South Carolina. A massive earthwork fortress guarding Charleston Harbor. Thick walls, heavy artillery, and 1,700 Confederate soldiers dug in behind reinforced positions. Military analysts on both sides agree. It's nearly impossible to take by direct assault. The Union has already tried once and failed miserably. Hundreds of casualties, zero progress. Now they're preparing for a second attempt, and someone has to lead the charge. Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, a 25-year-old white officer from a prominent Boston abolitionist family, volunteers his regiment. The 54th Massachusetts Infantry, one of the first official black regiments in the Union Army. His men have been training for months, desperate for a chance to prove themselves in combat. But they've been assigned to manual labor, digging trenches, loading supplies, building fortifications. The same work they would have done as enslaved people. Some white Union officers don't believe black soldiers should be in combat at all. They see them as useful for labor, but not for actual fighting. Shaw knows better. He's watched his men train. He's seen their discipline, their motivation, their absolute determination to prove that black soldiers can fight just as well as anyone else. So when the call comes for someone to lead the assault on Fort Wagner, he steps forward. His men will go first. straight into the teeth of Confederate defenses. Now, put yourself in the position of those soldiers for just a moment. You're about to charge across 200 yards of open beach. No cover, no protection, just sand and gunfire. You know the Confederates have been given orders to execute any black soldier they capture. You know that if you're wounded and left on that beach, there's no guarantee you'll be taken prisoner. You might just be shot where you lay. And you know that every single person watching this battle, Union and Confederate alike, is waiting to see if black soldiers will break and run when the bullets start flying. Everything is riding on the next 20 minutes. Not just this battle, not just this war. The entire question of black capability, black courage, black equality. It all comes down to whether your regiment can hold formation while walking into hell. At dusk, the order comes. Fix boy units. Forward march. 600 men of the 54th Massachusetts step onto that beach and begin their advance. The Confederate artillery opens up immediately. Cannonballs tear through their ranks. Men fall, blown apart by explosions. The survivors close ranks and keep walking. Rifle fire erupts from the fort walls. Musket balls rip through the air like angry hornets. More men fall. The regiment doesn't break. They don't scatter. They stay in formation exactly as they were trained, and they keep moving forward. William Carney, the 19-year-old sergeant we talked about earlier, is carrying the American flag. It's his job to keep that flag visible, to give his brothers something to rally around, to show everyone watching that this regiment will not retreat. A bullet hits him in the face. He staggers but doesn't fall. Another bullet tears through his shoulder. He switches hands and keeps the flag raised. A third bullet rips through his leg. He drops to one knee, blood pouring from multiple wounds, and he keeps that flag in the air. The 54th reaches the fort walls. They're climbing over bodies of their own dead, scrambling up the earthwork fortifications under point-blank fire. Some make it to the top. Hand-to-hand combat breaks out. Bayonets and rifle butts and desperate fighting in the darkness. Colonel Shaw reaches the parapet, turns to wave his men forward, and is shot through the heart. He falls back into the fort, dead. For a moment, it looks like the 54th might actually take the position. But there are too many Confederates, too much firepower. The Union support units that were supposed to follow the 54th into battle hesitate, fall back. The 54th is isolated, surrounded, taking fire from three sides. The order comes to retreat. The survivors pull back across that same deadly beach, carrying their wounded and William Carney, shot 3 times, bleeding from multiple wounds, refuses to let anyone else touch the flag. He drags himself back across 200 yards of sand, one agonizing step at a time, holding the American flag above the blood-soaked ground. When he finally reaches Union lines and collapses, the first words out of his mouth are, "Boys, the old flag never touched the ground." The 54th Massachusetts lost nearly half their regiment that day. 281 casualties out of 600 men. Colonel Shaw was buried by the Confederates in a mass grave with his black soldiers, meant as an insult. But Shaw's father later said there was no greater honor than to be buried with men who had fought so bravely. The Union didn't take Fort Wagner that night. In terms of military objectives, the assault failed. But something else happened on that beach. Something the Confederacy couldn't explain away or dismiss or ignore. Black soldiers had charged into the face of death with the same courage as any white regiment. They'd maintained discipline under fire. They'd fought hand-to-hand with Confederate veterans. They'd proven, beyond any shadow of doubt, that the foundational lie of the Confederacy was exactly that, a lie. Northern newspapers exploded with coverage. The New York Tribune wrote that the 54th had proved themselves among the bravest of the brave. Even publications that had been skeptical of black soldiers had to acknowledge what everyone had witnessed. And in the South, Confederate soldiers who'd been at Fort Wagner wrote letters home describing the ferocity of the black troops they'd faced. Some expressed shock, others grudging respect, but none of them could deny what they'd seen. After Fort Wagner, everything changed. The floodgates opened. Black enlistment exploded across the Union. By the end of 1863, there were over 50,000 black soldiers in uniform. By 1865, that number reached 180,000, roughly 10% of the entire Union Army. Add in another 20,000 serving in the Navy, and you're looking at 200,000 Black Americans in uniform, fighting to end slavery. They fought in over 400 battles. They served in every major campaign of the final 2 years of the war. At the Battle of Nashville, Black regiments broke the Confederate line so decisively that it destroyed the Army of Tennessee as an effective fighting force. At the Siege of Petersburg, Black soldiers were among the first to breach Confederate defenses, opening the door to Richmond and the end of the war. Ulysses S. Grant said it plainly in his memoirs. The use of colored troops was a measure of necessity. By arming the Negro, we have added a powerful ally. He wasn't being poetic. He was stating a military fact. Without Black soldiers, the Union doesn't win the war. Period. And here's the statistic that should be taught in every American classroom but isn't. Black soldiers suffered a casualty rate 35% higher than white soldiers. Not because they were reckless or poorly trained, but because Confederate forces targeted them specifically, executed prisoners, and refused to exchange captured Black soldiers in prisoner swaps. They knew what they were risking and they fought anyway. So here's the question nobody wants to answer. If Black soldiers were this crucial to Union victory, if they proved their courage and capability beyond any reasonable doubt, if they literally saved the United States from splitting apart, why don't we know their names? Why isn't William Carney as famous as Ulysses S. Grant? Why isn't the charge of the 54th Massachusetts taught with the same reverence as Gettysburg? Why did it take until 1937 years after Fort Wagner for Carney to finally receive his Medal of Honor? The answer is the same reason Captain Jim Williams was erased from history books. The same reason Reconstruction militias were written out of textbooks. The same reason every story of Black military success has to be rediscovered by each generation. Because if Americans knew the truth, if white America had to acknowledge that Black soldiers won the Civil War, crushed the KKK, and defeated white supremacist terrorism whenever they had the tools and organization to do so, it would shatter the entire narrative of American history. It would mean admitting that Black people were never passive victims waiting for white saviors. They were active agents of their own liberation. It would mean acknowledging that every time Black communities gained power, white America systematically dismantled it. Not because Black people failed, but because they succeeded. The story of the United States colored troops isn't a footnote. It's not a side story or a diversity bonus chapter. It's the story of how the United States survived. And it was buried because the truth was too dangerous to tell. 200,000 Black soldiers fought for a country that didn't recognize them as citizens. They died for a flag that represented their enslavement. They charged into battle knowing capture meant execution, knowing victory wouldn't guarantee their freedom, knowing their sacrifices would be erased from history. And they did it anyway, because they understood something that we're still learning today. Freedom is never given. It's taken. It's fought for. It's won by people who refuse to wait for permission to be free. January 1st, 1863, Abraham Lincoln signed a document that changed everything. But it wasn't the Emancipation Proclamation that freed the enslaved. It was the 200,000 Black soldiers who picked up rifles, put on uniforms, and fought their way to liberation. Their names were erased. Their battles were forgotten. Their victories were buried under a century of lies about Black incapacity and white benevolence. But here's what they couldn't bury: the truth. And now you carry it. You know what they didn't want you to know. You've seen through the lies they've been teaching for 150 years. The question is, what are you going to do with this knowledge? Because here's the reality. This video will only reach people if you share it. YouTube's algorithm doesn't promote content that challenges comfortable narratives. The establishment doesn't want this story going viral. They'd rather it stayed buried with William Carney and Jim Williams and the 200,000 soldiers who changed history. So if this story shook you, if it made you angry that you were never taught this in school, if it changed how you see American history, then you have a responsibility. Hit that like button right now, not later, now, because every like tells YouTube that this matters, that suppressed history deserves to be heard. Subscribe to the Forbidden Archive and turn on all notifications, because this is just one story. There are dozens more that have been systematically erased, and we're bringing every single one of them into the light. And most importantly, share this video. Send it to your family. Post it on your social media. Send it to that friend who still believes the sanitized version of history they learned in school. Because the only way suppressed history stays suppressed is silence. They tried to bury these soldiers. Don't let them succeed. Be the reason the story finally gets told. Like, subscribe, share, and I'll see you in the next one, where we uncover another truth they never wanted you to discover.